During a turbulent night, James flees into the woods from a farmhouse. The lady is following him outside when she is shot. Vincent and his son Simon douse her in gasoline, and Vincent then tosses a lit cigarette on her. A masked guy watches her in flames as they depart to follow James without giving her any assistance. An officer called Daniel Carter is stationed nearby. When Daniel comes upon the suffering James crawling along the road, he approaches him to aid him, believing the young guy could be inebriated. When the cop notices his condition, he hurries him to a neighboring hospital, where Allison Fraser, his estranged wife, works as a nurse with her colleague Beverly. Following a fire, the facility was mainly abandoned, leaving the workers operating as a skeleton crew. Kim, a medical intern, is one of them. She is caring for a patient named Cliff. Daniel meets an elderly man and his pregnant granddaughter, Maggie, in the waiting room. They discuss the fire and the town's lack of progress. During their talk, Daniel overhears James screaming from his room until Dr. Richard Powell calms him down with medication. Dr. Powell believes the individual has suffered considerable trauma. Allison recognizes James from his ID and observes the several needle marks on his arm when inspecting his body. Later that evening, while Daniel and Allison are catching up, Dr. Powell stops them to explain that James will require some time to recuperate enough. Dr. Powell reveals what happened to him before departing. Dr. Powell offers his sympathy for Daniel and Allison, who had just lost their child, and advises them to take their time grieving and finally move on. While walking down the corridor, Daniel spots Beverly inside Cliff's room. As she stabs Cliff in the eye, her face is horrifically flayed. She turns around and starts skinning herself. Beverly approaches Daniel with scissors in her hand, despite Daniel's attempts to calm her down. She performs an offensive motion, causing Daniel to shoot her fatally. The remainder of the hospital staff rushes to the room after hearing the gunshot. Daniel, who is shocked to discover his deceased colleague still alive, narrates what occurred before heading to the restroom, where he falls from shock. Daniel had odd images of gloomy sky and barren countryside, with a gigantic triangular object, when losing consciousness. Dr. Powell and Allison aid Daniel and notify him that a state trooper is already on the scene to take over the matter. Daniel is advised to rest by the two, but he insists on returning to duty. Mitchell, a state trooper, greets Daniel in the corridor, alerting him of the slaughter at the farmhouse, with James as the leading suspect. Mitchell advises that they take him into custody. According to Mitchell, James has a lengthy history of problems and may have given Beverly something to make her act this way. Mitchell confiscates Daniel's pistol, dissatisfied with his handling of the incident. With the phone lines down, Daniel goes outside to his police cruiser to report Beverly's death, but receives no answer. A cult member in a white robe, with a black triangle on his face, stands in front of his automobile. When Daniel confronts him, the lights begin to dim, diverting his attention away from the rogue man, who approaches him with a knife. Despite his injuries, he tries to stand up, but he notices additional cult members steadily encircling the structure. Daniel withdraws to the hospital, where repose will keep him from bleeding out. Meanwhile, Beverly's body begins to quiver, and a strange-looking thing emerges from her lips. When Daniel regains consciousness, the cult members are standing nearby with knives in their hands. People in the hospital are wary of what the cult intends, because they can't call for help. They then hear a cry from one of the rooms, where James is battling for his life. Handcuffed to the bed, James attempts to keep as far away from Beverly as possible, who has now morphed into a tentacled monster. Mitchell freezes, perplexed by the sight, as Daniel tries to get James out of the room. After shooting rounds at the creature, which appears to be bulletproof, the three flee and close the door behind them. Daniel collects the rest, equipping himself with an axe and plotting their escape from the structure. The situation worsens when Vincent and Simon, who burnt the lady earlier, enter the lobby and hold him at gunpoint, ordering them to hand over James as the creature consumes Beverly's body. James refuses to accompany Vincent and Simon and threatens to murder Maggie as a result. Dr. Powell, concerned, tries to save Maggie by approaching James, but he is stabbed in the neck. Unbeknownst to them, the monster moves up behind Mitchell, its tentacles encircling his torso. Daniel tries to save him, but it's too late since the thing smashes Mitchell's eyeballs. Daniel is thrown by the beast as he attempts to exterminate it. The two shoot at the head and hack it down till it stops moving, just as Vincent and Simon arrive. Daniel hurries back to the others, telling them to shelter in the office while he deals with the matter. After seeing the atrocities that resulted in Simon's wounded vocal cords, Vincent and Simon arrive, fighting with Daniel. Vincent refuses to believe the gang and seeks to assassinate Daniel. Simon prevents him from doing so, believing that they must collaborate to leave the hospital. With no more knowledge besides the prospect of the creature resurrecting, they burn Mitchell's body and throw it outdoors to prevent it from taking on the creature's shape. They arrive at the workplace to discover Maggie in labor. The remainder of the group is terrified by Vincent's continuing violence. Allison explains to Daniel the need to gather medical supplies from the basement. Despite the danger, Daniel relents, but first he must arm himself. He hatches a plan with Vincent and Simon to steal his shotgun from his police car. In the dark, they discover Daniel's car parked further away than he had left it. The cult is nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, the gang moves Maggie to another room and places her down as she goes into labor. Allison goes to the basement alone to get supplies, since she doesn't want to wait any longer. Behind her is a revived Dr. Powell. Simultaneously, Daniel triggers the automobile strobe lights, showing the cult hidden in the dark woods in front of them. One of them assaults Simon, but Daniel protects him. They hurry back into the hospital. When they return to the building, Daniel is irritated that Kim left Allison alone, so he goes to the basement to save her. They observe the disappearance of Dr. Powell's body in the corridor that used to be beneath the cover, but they kept looking for Allison. A phone rings in the basement, showing that Dr. Powell is on the other end of the line, calmly saying that he genuinely understands what causes the tentacle things to emerge from the victims. Vincent looks through images in a safety box that show the doctor's involvement in the deadly cult. Daniel obtains the necessary medical materials and delegates Maggie's operations to Kim. Kim becomes overwhelmed by the strain, causing her to panic. She is currently undergoing training. Kim, Maggie's grandfather, and Maggie are forced to bear the horror of being alone as Daniel, Vincent, and Simon question James after discovering him among the images. Because he is afraid of being tortured, James discloses that Dr. Powell is the leader of a group of individuals that participate in horrible actions and has the capacity to convert people. They compel the distressed James to accompany them down to the basement. After witnessing the structure surrounded by cult members, he feels even more terrified. She guides Daniel and others to the room Allison intends to go to, with the aid of Kim via radio, but the transmission gets unstable. Kim learns after a while that they took an unfamiliar set of stairs that may lead to a perilous location. When Allison regains consciousness, she finds herself on an operating table, where Dr. Powell claims that he has discovered a new technique to fight death. This is due to the traumatic passing of his daughter, Sarah, which has caused him to resort to alternative methods of survival. Allison, who is perplexed by his statements, is motionless due to medicines administered to her. She begs the doctor to save her life, but he says it's too late. Kim has completely lost connection with the others, as she struggles to care for Maggie and is now compelled to inject a pain medication into the pregnant lady. In the meanwhile, the gang notices a chamber with a triangle emblem. Despite Vincent's protests, Daniel is determined to discover the contents of the room. Dr. Powell explains in the operation room that he will resurrect his daughter through Allison. Dr. Powell uncovers Allison's body, where something is fast growing inside of her. He claims that she will transform into something extraordinary as her tummy twitches wildly. Back in the basement, Daniel, Simon, Vincent, and James explore a hidden area filled with disfigured bodies, brought back to life by a terrible power. The animals, with their fragmented bodies, migrate toward the group in order to hurt them. The corpses give them the illusion, but Vincent, who has been facing them for a while, snaps out of it. The corpses begin assaulting them with grotesque forms and even superhuman power. The four battle them before seeking refuge in various parts of the room. James strikes Daniel, but the officer manages to knock him off, causing him to be pulled away by a mutilated beast. Maggie becomes weaker upstairs, and the longer she works, the whiter her complexion appears, signaling that she may not live long. Kim is hesitant to perform an emergency C-section due to her fear of the circumstance, but the grandpa begs her to collect her strength and rescue his granddaughter. Maggie, on the other hand, stands up and slices her grandfather's neck before revealing that she is the mother of Dr. Powell's unborn child. As her due date approaches, her body has been captured by a sensation of fresh vigor. What was giving her anguish is now empowering her. Kim glances at Maggie, terrified, but Maggie assures her that everything will be all right. Maggie's behavior and personality have changed dramatically, as if something or someone is exerting influence over her. Soon, Kim watches the cult members enter the building, prompting her to flee, but she is once again caught by others, who are near the door. As the three guys divide in the basement, she locks herself in a room to escape. Vincent and Simon have a recurring dream, in which Vincent blames his son for the loss of their family. He then attacks his son, after saying cruel things to him. Simon fires a flare rifle into Vincent's chest, breaking them both out of the illusion. After regaining consciousness, Vincent apologizes to his kid and accepts his fate. Kim, who is hiding in the vents, attempts to phone Daniel for assistance, but the radio isn't functioning. As a cult member approaches, she stifles a scream. Daniel sees Allison inside the surgery room, in the last stages of her pregnancy, remembering how distraught they were when their kid passed away. Dr. Powell's voice lingers in Daniel's thoughts, reminding him of how relieved he appeared when they learned about it. Allison morphs into a tentacle creature, with slimy appendages spreading from her body in an instant. Daniel viciously strikes Allison's already altered body with an axe, refusing to let her become a monster. Unconscious, Daniel is carried to a mortuary, where Dr. Powell claims to have defied God after discovering the capacity to conquer not only life, but also the afterlife. Furthermore, he assures Daniel that he will be reunited with his kid only if he is ready to perish first. Maggie seems to stab Daniel from behind, before approaching Dr. Powell, who now looks to be skinless. Maggie kneels in front of him, and looks at him with great devotion as he recites a mantra in front of the triangle that unfolds. Dr. Powell then returns to Maggie and strokes her head as if to bless her. Maggie panics when she gets visions of the thing in her body. She screams till her tummy explodes, giving birth to a massive monstrous beast. Sarah, according to the doctor, has been reincarnated. Simon and Vincent fire at the creature from a safe distance, but it pursues them and prepares for terrible conflict. The monster kidnaps Vincent, and Simon tries to save him. After nearly being pulled along, Vincent drenches it with isopropyl alcohol, and orders his son to light it ablaze. Simon pauses. Vincent, unable to murder his father, forces him to see the apparition of his wife and infant behind his son. Simon throws the flare as the thing mutilates him, his eyes filled with anguish as he witnesses his father in such a dreadful situation. Simon flees into the vet's office to avoid the horror. At the same time, Dr. Powell informs Daniel that if he stops resisting and begins cooperating with his astral ability, he can be reunited with Allison. However, Daniel refuses to join him and tackles him, causing them to fall into the void. The corridor upstairs trembles as Simon flees another monstrous creature. Simon leaps forward as the walls close in on them, barely escaping. He looks behind him and sees that the hospital is normal. He's back in the real world, where he meets up with Kim around dawn. The cult members vanished as if nothing had occurred. Dr. Powell and his disciples have vanished into the vacuum, but Daniel and Allison are holding hands in a strange realm beneath the Black Pyramid, where they have been reborn. They remain undamaged souls imprisoned in a nothingness, uncertain if this is the end or the beginning.